Welcome to Season 2 of Breaking the Line, the ECNL podcast, featuring ECNL President and CEO Christian Lavers and Vice President Doug Bracken. If you have a question you want answered on Breaking the Line, the ECNL podcast, email us at info@theecnl.com. I'm Dee Linke, and here's what you can expect on this week's show. To do that, we start with ECNL President and CEO Christian Lavers.
There is a study that we just found that is titled Relative Age Effect Across the Talent Identification Process of Youth Female Soccer Players in the United States, Influence of Birth Year, Position, Biological Maturation, and Skill Level.
ECNL Medical Advisor Dr. Drew Watson breaks down this issue, this study, biobanding, relative age effect, and so much more.
I'm sympathetic to the motivation behind it, but I do think that this sort of singular focus on physical development fails to recognize all the things that there are about being a young athlete or kid.
ECNL Vice President Doug Bracken also has a take.
There's art and science, but it's more art than we probably give it credit for.
ECNL's Ashley Willis says there's a lot to take in the June 5 show.
My brain was spinning the entire time in a really good way.
And conveniently so, it starts right now after this very important message from a big-time sponsor for the ECNL, Continental Tire. This is Dean Linke with a special message from my good friends at Continental Tire. Enter for a chance to win the Continental Tire ECNL Sweepstakes. The first 2,500 entries will receive a custom mini scarf. Plus, one randomly selected fan will win an all-expense-paid trip to the All-Star Game in Columbus, Ohio, July 15 through 18. Visit continentaltire.votigo.com to enter now. Official rules apply. Welcome back to Season 2, Breaking the Line, the ECNL podcast, a new format, informal yet exciting, where we not only answer your questions, we have great guests, and we talk about the topics that matter. The key figures on the show, the CEO and President of the ECNL, Christian Lavers, and the Vice President, Doug Bracken, among others. And like I did 2 weeks ago, I'll turn it over to Christian Lavers. Take it away, Christian.
Thank you, Dean. Appreciate it. We are here also with Dr. Drew Watson, the ECNL Medical Advisor, as well as sports medicine pediatrician, ultra marathoner, philosopher, and all other accomplishments.
Former wrestler,
former soccer player, sort of Renaissance man. So we appreciate you being here, Dr. Watson. I'm sure you appreciate that introduction.
Yeah, I'm not sure anybody has ever included all of those things into an introduction. For me, that was by far the most thorough I've ever had.
Well, we pride ourselves on detail. Again, off camera. This is 2 weeks in a row, Ashley's off camera, but this time in the airport on her way to ECNL, North Carolina, I believe. Is that correct, Ashley?
Live from Austin Airport.
All right, there you go. A woman of few words. So we'll start here again, as we did last week, going back to the questions that were sent in, because we do want to address the questions that we think are relevant and interesting. So Ashley, you want to touch base on what we got coming in the last 7-10 days?
Yeah, I think it's great to see so many questions coming in, but with Dr. Watson on, why don't we touch base on the relative age effect? So questions coming out of California: if the birth year method can't be changed as a whole, is it possible to allow a certain number of spots for players who fall in the trapped player category? Or is it possible to get away from birth method?
I think I also saw another question or comment that actually asked about expanding the number of trapped players that was sent in. So why don't we first talk about what a trapped player is and how we use trapped players. And I guess I'll begin that with the trapped player is another attempted solution to the birth year problem of registration that we've talked about over the last couple of podcasts. So we allow trapped players in trapped 8th grade, trapped juniors. Doug, do you want to describe a little bit about the numbers that we allow and how often we allow them in those two categories?
First, I'll tackle the 8th grade, the trapped 8th grader, where their teammates of their actual team who are a year in school ahead of them are off playing in high school, and they're left without really a team. We allow 2 of those players per ECNL conference game. So a club could play what are U15 players in a U14 game with a limit of 2 per game. And I think the reason we did that, and Christian, you can expand on this, is we don't want the outcome of these games to be really impacted at a large scale by trap players.
It's like
Sorry.
everything, we're trying to balance these two contrasting issues. So these are eighth graders who are U15 age because of birth year, who are allowed to play U14 games during the high school season when they don't have a team to play with. So they're technically playing down.
Right.
We tried to figure out what is the right number of players to allow to do that, to provide some relief to the kid who does not have age appropriate competition. But knowing that if you bring down a bunch of older players, that does have an impact on the competition and to some degree, the fairness of the competition. So we picked 2, thinking that that is a reasonable number to allow clubs to manage game by game, because it can be a different 2 every game if they want, but that it won't unfairly or too much unfairly impact the actual U14 players, if that makes sense.
And then if you look at the trap juniors who are U18, 19, as far as age eligibility, we do not allow any of those players to play down during the conference season. And the obvious reason is that they are not in the same situation where the players on their team are in high school and the younger team is not. Essentially, both age groups are playing in high school. So we don't allow that. But what we do allow is an unlimited number of trap players to play in the U17 age group at any of our national showcases, so that they're getting the showcasing with that younger group and, in theory, more of their school year classmates. And then when we get to the playoffs, we have a limited number of players that are allowed to play in every division except for the Champions League. We think the Champions League, since it is the highest level of competition in our playoffs, that should remain as it is. But in the lower divisions, North American Cup, Showcase Cups, we allow a limited number of trap players to play in those as well. So we're trying to balance, as Christian said, and have a solution for these guys, both when they don't have a team at the 8th grade level to compete with, and then when their teammates are seniors and they're juniors, so that they can get the proper showcasing they need along the way. So that's kind of how we've tried to tackle it.
That's another area where that trap junior, because if you think of our showcase schedule where you get 3 showcases as typically as a U16, 3 as a 17, 1 as an 18 in terms of what your ECNL schedule is, those trap juniors, when they become juniors, if they're U18 juniors, they only get 1 showcase with that age group. So they get shortchanged in terms of exposure at what is typically the biggest age for exposure. In this one, we say that allowing an unlimited number, will it affect the results in the showcase to some degree? Maybe, but that the balance there skews more to the player wanting the showcase opportunity, because that's ultimately what the league is about. So on all these things, and I think as I've listened back to some of our podcasts, a lot of what we're trying to do is finding a balance between competing interests, or between principles that are both valid, but are on opposite ends of a sort of a decision matrix.
The real tough part of that, besides trying to figure out the balance and number of exceptions that you make as a league to accommodate these players, is this is the same player that's affected twice in their youth career, because they're not going to become untrapped. I mean, so they suffer this experience in 8th grade, and they suffer this experience as juniors as well. And then again, potentially as seniors, when we have to try to put them together with the team that was younger than them the previous year. So it's not great that the same kind of population of players that we have experience this kind of multiple times during their youth career. But as we are right now, it is what it is, and you have to try to make the best of it.
We're going to stay on this topic because there's some more information here. And we have another expert, as we said, with Dr. Watson. And again, ignoring all the jokes about the multiple sort of things he's done in his life, he is a sports medicine pediatrician, so uniquely qualified to weigh in from a medical perspective, and a former coach. He can add some things that maybe Doug and I and Ashley as lay people can't on this topic. So welcome, Drew. Glad to have you here again.
Yeah, always happy to be here. I think this is like the third time I've been on or so, but this topic in particular, I think is really interesting for me. So looking forward to it.
I think one of your undergraduate degrees was in statistics or something like that. Am I correct?
It wasn't an undergrad degree, but I do a lot of it in my day-to-day work.
Okay, so you know things like chi-square analysis and bands of confidence and things like that.
Sure. Yeah, those are some of my favorites.
I like how he says sure, as
Yeah,
in everybody should.
That's an indication that he's tired of the line of questioning from me as well. So, but I bring that up because there is a study that we just found that was published. It looks like it was published less than 2 weeks ago. That is titled "Relative Age Effect Across the Talent Identification Process of Youth Female Soccer Players in the United States: Influence of Birth Year, Position, Biological Maturation, and Skill Level." So the first thing I guess I would say is that is the most verbose title I've ever heard in my life. But we found this because it was actually published. A U.S. soccer employee or former was one of the authors. And this purports to do some studying about club, talent ID, and youth national team rosters in 21-22, that season, I believe. Some of the other pieces of information in here are interesting as well. But the results of the study are particularly relevant because if we go back, the whole justification, or at least the primary justification of changing from school year to birth year, was because it would have an impact on relative age effect, which we've covered in a podcast and a half. And so that was done in 2017. So here we are, fast forward 7 years, and we have a study looking at female players in the United States in talent ID about relative age effect with all sorts of statistical analysis, which I'm sure Drew can talk through. And I am going to read from this. I got to get to the right page here. I'm going to read in the discussion section, because again, I'm going to say this again. One of the primary justifications for changing to birth year was it would help with relative age effect. And I think I read the press release in a podcast a couple weeks ago. This is language from the study. Quote, "This study investigated relative age effect prevalence of youth female soccer players in the U.S. across 3 stages of the talent identification process. The main findings were: 1, relative age effect was present in club and talent ID, but not in youth national teams. 2, relative age effect existed for most positions in club and talent ID centers." And then I'll continue on here. "Our data indicates relative age effect for club players with Q1 players." So Q1 players are people born January, February, or March. That's relative age effect. "Overrepresented between U13 and U17. Similar patterns were observed at U.S. Soccer Talent ID centers, with Q1 overrepresented from U13 to U16. So this study comes out and says that actually changing to birth year has done little or nothing to combat relative age effect, which is exactly what everybody said at the beginning and what we said 4 weeks ago. So Drew, you have the statistical background and analysis on this. So you read this study as well. So I'll pause here and let you make some comments on what you saw when you looked at this study.
Yeah, it's very dense, and there are a lot of different analyses that get done to look at the relationships between birth quartile distributions and talent ratings and maturity level. I do think the big take home is that it continues to look like there's a disproportionate number of athletes that are in those first and second birth year quartiles, meaning that kids born earlier in the 12-month window, regardless of whether it's arranged by academic or birth year, are overrepresented in both the talent ID and the club settings. So clearly this relative age effect persists in spite of shifting from a academic calendar to a birth year registration. I mean, as you would expect it would, right? There's nothing about shifting that 12-month window that's going to change the fact that the kids in the early 6 months of it are going to, on average, be bigger, faster, and stronger than the others. The pieces about the relationships with maturity level are a little tricky because maturity level was determined just by the scouts looking at players from the sideline. which is a little hard to have too much confidence in. There's a little bit of evidence that coaches who are familiar with players can actually pretty reasonably estimate their maturity level, but I would be a little cautious about how to interpret ratings that come from someone who just watches them play once or twice. But I think like you mentioned, the big take home here is just that since 2017, when we transitioned to birth year registration, that disproportionate representation of older athletes within their age group is still there.
So it hasn't accomplished what we hoped it would accomplish.
I'm going to be a lot more simple than Dr. Drew. If the duration or the time frame that you're measuring is 1 year, I don't know how having it start in August or start in January will change anything about relative age effect. Still 1 year of time.
I'm going to put some real numbers to this from this study so people get a sense of this. So if we look at talent ID centers, so these are U.S. soccer female talent ID centers, and they broke out the players, the total number of players selected to these in each age group, and then which quarter of the year they were born in. So you get a real sense of what we talk about when we mean this. So for example, 2008, which was the U14 age group at the time of this study, there were 434 players that were invited into these talent IDs. 167 of them were in January, February, March birth dates. 116 were April, May, June. 91 were in the third quarter and 60 in the fourth quarter. So if you look at that, 38% of the selections for the U14 talent ID were born in the first 3 months of the year. That is about as stark an example of what relative age effect is as you can possibly get. If you go to U15, 387 players invited in, 130 of them were from the first quarter, so 33.6%. You go to U16, so that was the 2006 birth year, 292 players invited in, 34% of them, or 101 of them, from the first quarter of the year, only 32 players from the last quarter of the year. That is exceptionally stark when you look at the selections made for talent ID.
It is interesting in the sort of broader literature, there's some suggestion that maybe the relative age effect has a greater impact on the boys' side. But this would seem to suggest that it is perhaps just as impactful in these settings on the girl side as it is on the boys. And it just sort of seems to persist, right? It's present at early age groups. Right. So like if you look at the 2009s, that U13 age group, I don't think you tick that one off. I mean, that one has something like 44% of the athletes from the first birth quartile at the training ID camp. So it seems to begin early, and it seems to persist, and it seems to be present on both the boys and the girls' side, particularly within soccer, where we think that the associated physiologic characteristics that come along with being on the older end of an age group have an impact on your likelihood of success.
Well, and if I'm reading this correctly, I mean, talent ID centers, there's a variety of ways. I mean, that's a whole nother podcast of how players are scouted or identified or recommended for those talent ID centers. But these are selected by federation scouts. So in theory, these are people that are quote unquote trained or taught in how to evaluate players. And that relative age effect is dramatic, even in that environment, when, again, one of the arguments for moving to this was to eliminate or reduce that impact. Other parts of this study that are interesting. So it looks at 3 different levels. So club rosters, talent ID rosters, and then actual youth national team camps. And so if you look at the club rosters, so these are the teams, the club teams from which these players are. And there was a total sample here of, I think, 1,940 players in these club rosters that were accounted. And you see very similar relative age effect numbers. So again, looking at U14, 37% of the players in these club teams were from the first quarter. At U15, the 2007 age group, 33%, 36% in 2006. There was one interesting skew from that, which is at U18, which was the 2004 birth year, was by far the highest number of Q4 players or kids born in October, November, and December. In that sample, there were 23% of the selections born in Q4. Every other age group was no more than 12 or 15%. One of them as low as 3%. So at the U18 age group, there was more kids born later in the year. There still was a strong Q1 presence, but there were more in Q4. And what's interesting about that is that would have been the age group that spent the longest amount of time in a club-based system that was school year based, because those kids were 2004 birth years. So that means when the age group was changed in 2017, they were 13 years old. So you would make some, I think, Drew, you can tell me if my logic here breaks down, but you could make an argument that those kids all the way up to age 13 who were in school year clubs where the cutoff was August 1, if we then fast forward after this, there are more kids late in the year that made that sort of cut than in the other age groups, because maybe they were in that system where there was two different age groups longer. Does that logically make sense to you, or do you poke holes in that?
I think this one is tricky. If I understood this right, and I had to read it a few times, I believe that the 2004 age groups and the older ones that are included in the youth national team analysis, they actually used the pre-2017 cutoffs to make their quartiles. So in other words, Q1 and Q2 for the U18 age group are actually August to January. But if you look at those numbers, you've still got over 60% of the athletes that are in Q1 and Q2.
Okay, so you're saying that Q1 for that age group is actually measured August, September, October?
Correct.
So then that would prove the point again that RAE is wherever you put your cutoff.
Right. I think that's exactly right. It suggests that even though they switched at U13, when they're U18, you still see this persistence of somewhere close to around a little, well, we're like, what, 57-ish and change percent? I mean, still over half are coming from
First 6 months.
First half of the year when those teams were sort of originally formed.
What would you make on then why is Q4 so big at U18 compared to the other years?
It's sort of hard to know. It is more. And I think what you get at U18 is you get sort of like a combination of the two different registration frameworks. So you have, up until this group was U13, they were on, the traditional academic calendar. And then for the next 3 to 4 years before this study was done, they were on the birth year calendar. So you're sort of seeing this like combination. And it looks like maybe to me, like, you can get into the details around statistical significance levels. And ultimately, like, there isn't a statistically significant finding within these groups. But if you just look at them descriptively, it suggests that like what you do at young ages seems to kind of carry through, but that, there's been a little bit of a softening of the impact by the last few years that they were on the birth year registration, all of which I think just sort of helps or not amplify, but just sort of underline the fact that, the relative age effect has been real under both circumstances and really hasn't been attenuated by shifting to a birth year registration.
But could it say that at 18 years old, the physical maturation of a player is now not as prevalent, the differences aren't as prevalent so if I'm 18 years old, is there less difference between physically and maturity wise from a Q1 to a Q4 player?
I mean, I think that statement is definitely true, that ultimately physical maturity level kind of evens out, right? Whatever early benefit you get from being an early maturing athlete in and of itself isn't going to make you physically better than somebody else at 18 years old.
Right.
Unless that affords you different developmental opportunities than somebody who's late maturing, right? Sort of, if you're being developed appropriately and challenged in line with your ability and your level of maturity and those sorts of things, you would hope that ultimately the maturity thing all evens out. And there might be a little bit of that at U18. It sort of depends on how much you would expect rosters to turn over from 17 to 18, just based on the fact that, kids who are later maturing might be catching up. And I couldn't possibly speak to that for the players that are involved in this study.
Right.
It is certainly possible that as you get into older ages, you start to see some of the later maturing younger athletes catch up from a physical standpoint. And maybe some of that quartile difference starts to reduce. It's kind of hard to know just from the numbers here.
Again, to repeat, this is in the journal Biology of Sport, volume 41, number 4, 2024, published in May. The other thing here that just jumps off the page to me is that the RAE, the relative age effect finding, is exceptionally clear at the club level, which is sort of like entry level to Talent ID. It is exceptionally clear at the Talent ID centers, which is where all the recommendations for players to take that next step into consideration for a national team. And then it miraculously disappears at YNT camps. So we have relative age effect everywhere up until the very last step in the Talent ID process. Then it looks much more balanced out when you look at the national team camp invites. So for example, if you look at U17, there were 47 players in here that were invited into a U17 national team camp over this time period, and they are almost equal. 13 from Q1, 13 from Q2, 10 from Q3, and 11 from Q4. So you have a difference of 4 to 5%. Those differences are relatively similar across each of these different age groups. The interesting thing about that is that the national team selections, one of the authors of this study was responsible or overseeing national team selections. So Drew, how does relative age effect just disappear at the youth national team camps when it exists everywhere else?
Hard to say. I mean, you could imagine an argument where some element of that selection process leans more heavily on things like technical or psychological or emotional sides of being a soccer player than just the physical side. You can't tell from a paper like this whether that's true or not. One thing that's just worth pointing out is that when you do get to that youth national team groups, the numbers get much, much smaller. And so just to get into the weeds a little bit on the statistical side of things, you're always going to struggle to find things with any confidence when you have relatively small numbers of players. So if you look at the 2007 age groups, the U15s, for example, 60% of them are still in Q1 and Q2, right? There is an overrepresentation there, but the numbers are small enough that your statistical approach doesn't make this statistically significant. So you say there's nothing there, but in reality, if you added in another 40 or 50 kids, you'd find that that was just as statistically meaningful as maybe some of the other analyses. So it's sort of limited in what you can infer from that. And I would have a lot of trouble feeling too confident about the idea that that relative age effect truly goes away. Some of that, I think, is probably a function of the relatively small numbers that make it hard to have any confidence in what you analyze.
All right. Well, again, biology of sport, relative age effect across the talent identification process of youth female soccer players in the United States, for anyone who's looking for that. So I think, there's a lot of subjective stuff in here, subjective evaluation of biological maturation, subjective evaluation of skill level, that type of thing. But the thing that is not subjective, and I think the one fact in here is that birth year registration has not had an impact on relative age effect in terms of selection processes anywhere along the line. Then is that a fair and accurate summary of this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know specifically what the proportions were in a similar group of athletes before 2017, but it is certainly still evident within this at that club and training ID level without question.
All right, so I think if we go all the way back to the first podcast where we questioned whether we could change this, we've talked about the negative impact on players. Now we've actually seen that one of the justifications for doing this is actually not working out in that way. It sort of continues to pile on evidence to make a change for it. Another way that this was attempted, relative age effect was attempted to be addressed, was through this concept of biobanding. And this was something that I think was popularized around the same time, 2017 through 2020 was when the term was bandied about the most. And this was this concept of put players together in competitions or training based upon some determination of biological development or physical development. So that I guess maybe I'll simplify it. Littler players or less physically developed players are together regardless of age cutoff, and more advanced or mature players are together regardless of age cutoff. Because I think, and Drew, you can correct me on this, a kid who is chronologically one age, so chronologically 11 years old, may be physically a year or two older or younger, mentally a year or two older or younger, socially a year or two older or younger, however those metrics are made. It's probably a gross oversimplification, but is that generally accurate?
Yeah, biological age, which gets very narrowly defined in clinical settings, is definitely not the same as chronological age. There's a very wide distribution of biological age around any particular age group. So like you mentioned, an 11-year-old chronologically, meaning born 11 years ago, they could be physically, anywhere from 9 to 13, or even rarely more, physically more like 8 or 14. So there's a potential for a huge range of maturity levels around any specific chronological age. And I think the reason that this sort of concerns people is that if we think that physical maturity and the things that come along with it lend themselves to success in certain sports, then in an effort at being fair, we're trying to put people into categories that undermine some of this, right? I mean, that's the whole reason you have age groups and you don't have 11-year-olds playing 18-year-olds is because we think the 18-year-olds would be too big and fast and strong and it wouldn't be fair. So age groups exist largely for that reason. The same could be said of biological maturity. And I think the concern that people have is that they look at a soccer field and they see, some kids who look much more physically mature than others, and they assume that late maturing or less mature player is therefore going to get sort of squeezed out of opportunities or cast aside or unable to succeed because of that. So I think the motivation was to try and undermine some of that potential discrepancy.
We're going to take a quick break to once again hear from Continental Tire. When we return, Christian Lavers will continue to drive the conversation of biobanding with Dr. Drew Watson, the ECNL Medical Advisor, joined by Doug Bracken, the VP, and also listening in, Ashley Willis, a key part of the ECNL as well. More on biobanding after this important message from Continental Tire. This is Dean Linke with a special message from my good friends at Continental Tire. Enter for a chance to win the Continental Tire ECNL Sweepstakes. The first 2,500 entries will receive a custom mini scarf, plus one randomly selected fan will win an all-expense-paid trip to the All-Star Game in Columbus, Ohio, July 15 through 18. Visit continentaltire.ecnl.votigo.com to enter now. Official rules apply. As promised, we pick up the conversation right where we left off with Christian Lavers talking about biobanding.
So biobanding, you see this a lot. The age group that sort of stands out to me the most is like U13, U14 boys, where you'll see one boy who looks 5'10", 5'11", 140 pounds and shaving. And then next to them, you see a kid who's 4'11" and his voice is squeaking. And they're the same age group in terms of chronological age. So biobanding would say, all right, well, the way to address some of the problems here would be to take all the bigger, stronger, early maturing kids, put them into one group, and let them compete with each other, train with each other, and then take all the smaller, late maturing kids, put them together, let them train with each other, regardless of chronological age, regardless of social factors. So one of the things we've talked about is how that gets done when all you do is look at the physical side and not look at what happens when you say to a player, you are not as big, not as strong, therefore you are going to go play with the younger players or the littler players, which will be easier for you. And we are going to separate you from your peer group in terms of chronological age. And we are going to put you over here with kids that are probably many of them younger than you, some of them similar age, but sort of label you as either small, weak, not as fast, or big, strong, powerful, or very technically focused versus just relying simply on physical attributes. How do you look at that sort of separation when it's done purely from a physical perspective in terms of the impact on a player?
And let me say from the outset, like I am sympathetic to the motivation behind it, right? Like I was 100-pound wrestler as a freshman in high school. Like I was growing into college. I've passed that along to my kids, right? Like I have a daughter who's a trapped 8th grader and late maturing. Like I'm sympathetic to the motivation behind it. But I do think that this sort of singular focus on physical development really fails to recognize all the things that there are about being a young athlete or kid. Like there is so much more to being a soccer player than just how, tall or fast or strong you are. And it kind of ignores the fact that physical development does not necessarily align with psychological or emotional development. And moving kids around exclusively based on that runs a real risk of having very malaligned groups of athletes with respect to their psychological or emotional levels of maturity. And it doesn't, at least to me, seem like there's a lot of consideration of that unintended consequence, other than when you see, publications about biobanded events. There's usually sort of a couple lines in there about how the participating clubs were asked to make sure that they took consideration of each player's technical or emotional development, but no real understanding of exactly what that means or how it gets done. And as it seems to be operationalized or recommended, it really does just sort of narrowly focus on the level of physical maturity. And I think you're just swapping out some things for others when you organize kids based on that rather than along their typical age group. Not to mention, like you just stated, that by moving them around in that way, you are taking them out of their peer group. And I think sometimes we fail to recognize how vitally important that is for young athletes. I also think this was one of the maybe unintended consequences of shifting to a birth year registration, is that kids no longer had or at least kids sometimes didn't have the opportunity to enter into or continue to participate in soccer with their classmates, because now they were split between age groups. And that is really how most elementary school kids get into playing sports, is they have teammates, they experience it in gym, they have neighbors, and they join teams together. So that's a little bit of a tangent, but the point is, I think singularly focusing on physical maturity just sort of ignores all of the other really vitally important parts about being a young soccer player that I think could have some significant unintended consequences.
Could you say, Drew, in a simple way, we're trying to maybe apply science to something that is not so simple to apply? There's art and science, but it's more art than we probably give it credit for.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And that was all just like broad strokes about whether it would even be the right thing to do if you could do it accurately and precisely. And I think the other really big limitation here is that the ways you determine somebody's level of physical maturity, and it's sort of important to recognize that the techniques you use to develop these biobanded groups aren't necessarily the actual physical characteristics that we think inform soccer success. It's not actually strength or speed. It's maturity, which is sort of a proxy for that, just like age is kind of a proxy for that. But even if you could accurately measure maturity level in order to inform these groups,
Well, Drew, can I interrupt and ask a question on that? Because I think what you just said was really interesting, because you're using maturity as a proxy for performance outcome, is what it sounds like I just heard. So because somebody is more mature physically, you're almost assuming that that player is going to be successful solely based on that feature, regardless of any other attributes. And at the same time, this smaller player or less mature player is going to be unsuccessful solely based on those physical attributes with no other. I mean, you already talked about the psychological factors that aren't considered in that, and that's probably more from a holistic perspective. But if you even just look from a soccer perspective, you're making some very, very big and general assumptions by using physical maturation as this proxy. Is that an accurate statement?
I think so. And even beyond success, like it's sort of a proxy for the characteristics that we think lend themselves to success. So like if you take groups of people, like on average, the more mature kids are going to be faster and stronger than the less mature. But what sort of gets lost in all of the presentation of it is that works on like big group levels, but it doesn't necessarily work out every time individually. So you can have an early maturing kid who happens to have two shorter parents, right? He may still be not as tall as a late maturing kid whose parents are like 6'2" and 6'4", right? It doesn't, maturity level is not a one-to-one representation of the physical characteristics that might lend themselves to soccer performance. It tends on aggregate to mean that the more mature players are bigger, faster, stronger than the less mature. So you could, even without sort of delving into the limitations of estimating physical maturity, it is not always going to work on an individual level as it relates to being a soccer player.
We could all reasonably argue some of the opposite of that concept, in that a kid who is smaller, earlier, later maturing, has to fight a little bit harder. Maybe that changes their psychology, their determination, which is obviously hard to measure. And that at the end of the day, that player has just as much of a chance of being successful as a kid who is bigger, stronger, faster at 13 or whatever. I think we've all seen that. It's hard to pinpoint that all or nothing kind of idea of you're bigger, stronger, faster, earlier, you're the one, you're going to make it, versus if you're smaller and then you're not going to make it.
Yeah. That's the quote underdog hypothesis, right? That is, you have to solve problems more creatively, more technically, more sort of thoughtfully than if you can simply solve them through brute force. And I think, you guys are going to know better than me, but to the extent that this was something I was cognizant of in coaching, like this really is where educated and sophisticated coaching comes into play at the club level. Is if you have early maturing kids who are clearly solving problems by smashing a ball and chasing it, you put them into an environment where they can be challenged in other ways within your training environment or your club. And late maturing kids, you're thrilled to see them try and solve problems with creativity. But if that's not enough, then they have opportunities to play in environments where maybe they aren't quite as overpowered. But this is sort of what, to me, like sophisticated clubs are doing already. The problem with the underdog hypothesis is just if those late maturing smaller players they stop playing, right? Like if you lose them completely, then there is a clear long-term benefit of maturing early. If you can keep athletes participating and you can have everybody get to 17 or 18 years old, then you may actually see that those late maturing players did benefit from having to be more creative in the way they solved problems without the sort of physical characteristics to do it.
That was my thought on the U18 age group, as we kind of talked about it, is that relative age effect becomes less prevalent because the physical maturation and everybody's kind of playing on the same, quote unquote, playing field now. And we don't have those other than some kids are going to be faster, right. But in my experience doing this, I'm sure, Christian, you would say the same. You see a lot less of that as you matriculate through the age groups. Like, to me, it gets to be a little bit less and less as we get older and older or farther down the line.
Yeah, and I think Drew's point about if all the smaller late maturers quit because they're just, obliterated in the competition field and they drop out of the sport, that's the problem. But if they don't, and they are just constrained by these factors and they have to solve problems differently, and then they become a different type of player because of it, that is a very, very different outcome. It just seems to me, the more I listen to this, both of these topics, so biobanding, which sounds like, I'm going to describe it as almost a hack job solution as the way it was presented of, let's look at these two kind of easily measurable things to determine whether you're early or late mature, throw you in a group and say, look, we've solved this problem of biobanding. And it's great to protect late developers. And it ignores all of these other factors. And it's just so generalized. It's almost garbage in, garbage out. It's so general that it has no applicability at an individual level.
Yeah. So just to sort of expand on it, like, even if ultimately we thought that what we wanted to do was make a good faith effort at organizing everybody by physical maturity level rather than chronological age, the available methods to do this in a scalable, low cost, non-invasive way just aren't particularly good. So, the way that we determine physical maturity level clinically is by things like physical examination, bone age, which is a wrist x-ray. You don't really scale that to big populations. And the tools that are sort of variously recommended for how to estimate this in kids aren't, in my opinion, nearly accurate enough to actually operationalize this in a meaningful way. If you make categories out of maturity, which isn't really how nature or biology work, but if you just make early, on time, and late maturing categories, and you use that based on bone age and then based on some estimation equation, probably gets between a quarter and a third of them wrong. And they're particularly inaccurate among the kids who are at the later or the earlier end of maturity. So like exactly the ones that you're trying to move around are the ones where it doesn't do a particularly good job of identifying them. So again, even if you were looking to try and do this because you think it's a good idea, the available tools to do so, in my opinion, just aren't accurate enough. And you run a very real risk of just creating a whole bunch of sort of miscategorized kids, and you've sort of created a whole different set of unintended consequences as a function of the fact that the tools aren't very good.
This just hits me as well, because I think you've mentioned this before. Say you're going to take this very, very broad, generic solution based on the measurements, or observations that are easily done at mass quantity, calling out so obviously what you're doing in terms of, okay, these players are going over here because you need less physical demands to solve problems, or less physical challenges because you're late maturing. And these players are going over here because you tend to solve problems more physically and you need to be more constrained by the physicality and be forced to do other things. I just wonder what type of impact that has even on the thought process of the player when the player is being told so publicly and transparently, here is why we are doing this, because you are like this and therefore you need this, and whether that may not actually undermine the point of the whole exercise in terms of how that changes decision making and learning.
From just like an emotional or a psychological development standpoint for adolescents, period, like even if you take it outside of soccer, which adolescent kids do you know that want to be publicly pointed out for being different? I don't know any, right? Like I've had this conversation with my daughter, who again is going to be mortified that she's being discussed on a podcast. But again, she's born in the second half of the year.
I doubt she's going to listen to the subject matter. I'm just
I sit her down and make her listen to it.
Yeah, it's good.
We may figure out a way to get this on TikTok or something.
That'll be our 700th listen.
Then she'll see it and I won't. She's born in the second half of the year, right? She's a late maturing kid. Like I've had this conversation just with her in general, like sort of in the context of being a trapped eighth grader and potentially playing with like the younger age group, but even sort of like just having a conversation about the whole biobanding idea. She wasn't interested in it at all. She's like, I don't want to go down and play with the younger, smaller kids. Like she wants to be, I think on some level, I mean, and maybe she differs from other kids. Like she enjoys the challenge of being in an age group where, you know, a lot of the kids are bigger than she is. But I think that is a very difficult prospect if you were going to do it outside of very sort of narrowly curated situations and environments. Because particularly with the smaller athletes, I mean, you'd sort of be telling them, I mean, you'd try and explain it in a way that makes sense to you. But my expectation is that they probably hear like, you're small, you're not very developed, you're going to go down and play with the younger kids. And that may not be anybody's intention, but I can imagine that they might hear it that way.
By the way, what happens if they're successful doing that? Right. So you're small, you're less physically developed, you're going to go play with the younger kids. The kid does go do that and then is really dominant there.
Yeah.
Doesn't that then just flip the other way where then you have people saying, well, this is unfair, that kid's older. And you have this psychological pressure switch, 180 degrees.
You can imagine issues sort of coming from different directions. I think part of the motivation people have about having this sort of late maturing players play with kids their own sizes so that they can have some success. And I don't disagree with that, right? Like there'd be more opportunities for that player to try things in training without as likely a expectation of failure as they would in their own. But again, this is the sort of thing that you can do readily within a typical club training environment without having to have these kind of created environments to do it for you. I think the biggest issue for me, just thinking about adolescence period, is that as well as you explain it, I think the kids that you quote unquote move down it's hard to imagine that being an overall positive psychologically. I mean, I know there have been a couple studies of these events and players have, the late maturing players have said like they had a few more opportunities. They also reported that they felt a lot more pressure to outperform the kids around them. But it's sort of tricky to interpret that when they're in these kind of constrained and kind of created environments where kids are sort of selected specifically for it. I think if you tried to operationalize something like this on a large level, you'd see a fair amount of negative psychological impacts for players that get moved around, if for no other reason than it just sort of highlights the fact that they're different from their age group peers.
I think the reality is probably that this is better tackled, and this is a tough idea, but this is better tackled through coach education and a system that is more willing to sacrifice results in the name of development rather than a system that rewards winning in a number of ways, right? And whether that be more players come to you, your ability to recruit more players, whatever the list of things is. And there's probably no easy balance because we're always going to try to win. But, sometimes we probably do it at the detriment of development. And it probably also means we give less attention or patience to a late developer. We focus more on an early developer who can use their strength and size and all that stuff to do well in the earlier age groups or whatever. It's a tough thing to think about how you would solve it.
I think you don't solve it via press release. And that's I think that's a societal ill right now, is that if somebody claims a solution to a tough problem, then they solicit funding and all the attributes that go with having solved this major thorny problem. And to both of your points, this is really complicated, complex. It is not easily solved at an aggregate level. It's heavily individualized. It requires an informed and aware mind to deal with this and to do this in a way that is perhaps not so obvious to the player. And none of that actually is that helpful in a political perspective or in a sort of press release perspective of, hey, look, we solved relative age effect. We changed the birth year. Hey, look, we solved relative age effect. We do biobanding. Hey, look, we have this general thing that doesn't really solve anything individually, but it sounds good and it's got a trendy name, and bang, we've solved the problem. How great is that? Everybody move on. And I feel like that's not just a sports thing or a soccer thing. That's kind of a society thing and where we are today.
To your point, Doug, I think the education piece is really vital. I think back to when I was coaching before the transition to birth year registration. I don't think I had any idea when anybody's birthday was on the teams that I was coaching. I don't think I would have really thought about it, but I think having coaches be aware of the relative age effect is hugely valuable, because I imagine some of them are aware of it, but I bet within rosters probably don't realize that it's actually happening within their teams and clubs. But the education about how if you're really genuinely in the business of trying to generate the best 18-year-old players you possibly can, you're sort of shooting yourself in the foot in some ways by sort of preferentially including early maturing athletes at the expense of later maturing. And the ability to retain as many kids as you possibly can across all those levels of maturity is probably the most fruitful way to make sure that you have the best players transitioning out of your club when they're 18 years old. And then anything that incentivizes having really good players and teams at U18 would obviously be in service of that. There's probably a really big role for education here, because I bet there are a lot of people who aren't aware of the degree to which this is an issue, aren't aware of the degree to which it's actually happening, maybe within their own clubs without them knowing about it. Any incentivization for long-term development so that what you're really motivated to do as a club is to help as many players as possible leave your club at 18 years old in the best position they can be. Those two things to me sort of feed off of each other. But clearly, to Christian's point, transitioning from academic year registration to birth year registration did not solve this. And I think the ways in which it breaks up peer groups and sort of undermines the school-based entry into soccer, it may actually make it even a little bit worse. That I don't think there's any research there to point at, but intuitively, it makes me wonder whether in some ways it created additional problems without necessarily solving the relative age effect.
And from the club operator perspective, which I said on the previous podcast, it's been a problem. It's been a big problem for a lot of reasons. So the fact that it doesn't solve for what its stated mission to solve for, and then because I think we could all live with those challenges at a club level if we were actually solving a problem that existed. But the fact that we're not solving it, and we've created additional problems for club operators, and more than likely, even though to your point, there's not research to support it, that it probably, in fact, negatively impacts development. Could have thought about that one a little bit longer before we made the decision, or maybe talk to the people that have to implement what it is you're prescribing us.
Well, and even if it changes back the school year next year, these issues still remain to be addressed in an individualized manner within your individual training and competition environment. And as we talk through all these things, there is never going to be an easy answer for something as complicated as human development, physically, emotionally, cognitively. And then you add in the just other environmental dynamics of peer relations, parents, context, all that sort of stuff. All of these things factor into how do players develop, how fast, when, who ends up, at the highest level of performance. And it's a nuanced issue. And I think probably that's going to be true more often than not when we're talking about anything with respect to youth sport and youth soccer. And we talk about how do we do it better. And I go back to earlier on in the podcast, and we go back and forth on things like trap players. The more trap players you have, the more you're trying to correct for this, but the more you're then skewing the competition And by the way, that's not just about a win and a loss, but it's also you're creating different demands on the other players by bringing in older players, right? You're changing that environment. And so if nothing, I don't know that we've solved anything here. I think we've poked some holes in some sacred cows maybe, but it just points to the fact that all of this stuff is complicated. It needs real thought. It's not easy. Everybody's going to make mistakes trying to get it right. And all we can do is try and keep moving it forward, correct where we know we've made mistakes, and get it better. I mean, I guess that would be the perfect example of progress, right? We just get it a little bit better the next time around.
My son, who's played his trapped eighth grade year, will play it next year. He's a seventh grader on a team that is the majority eighth graders, so U14 team. And so they experience those trap players in the fall season coming down and playing for other clubs around. He often blames the times when they've lost to the fact that the other team had trap players playing. So it's a thing that the kids know, they discuss it, they talk about it. I reframe it and say, don't you think it's a great opportunity for you to play against tougher teams, better competition, helps you get better? So we try to reframe it, but it's the kids even kind of know.
I was hammering the coach education piece. There's a big educational piece for families as well, because I bet they're not nearly as familiar with this or the implications of it or the sort of prevalence of it. But that sort of framing around how you approach a difficult situation, if you are in an, unfortunately a trapped eighth grader in that sort of weird setting, probably goes a long way to helping that kid understand how to deal with the next thing that happens that doesn't seem fair, but is always going to be the case in all sorts of elements of their lives. No matter how you try and make categories out of biology, you're going to end up with edge cases and you're going to end up with situations that on their face don't seem necessarily fair or equitable. And we should be trying, I think, to make training and competition scenarios developmentally appropriate for the level of the individual player. But there are always going to be situations where something out of their control, seemingly unfair, happens. And helping educate families on how to work through that as an opportunity rather than something to ruminate over, I think is a really important message as well.
I think it's a great point about education, because that makes me think how much playing up. It's a confused issue, because if you asked the average parent, is your son or daughter playing up? If the answer is yes, there's some presumption and assumption that that means they're really, really talented, and playing on your own age group is some indictment. And then that turns around and that gets, it's a little bit exaggerated, but for lack of a better word, that gets weaponized, right? Of clubs saying, oh, well, over here, we're going to play this whole team up because they're so good, or we're going to come to my club and I'll play your kid up and your current club will not play your kid up. And therefore there is a developmental positive to that. And that's another one of those issues that from a general level is so misused and misunderstood that it creates problems. And I think that also probably dovetails in with all this trap stuff as well, is if generally the perspective of the public is playing up is good, then playing down is bad. And you take all the ramifications that come out from that.
Yeah, I mean, the analogy doesn't hold real great when you put pressure on it, but you could imagine, like, if your kid is, if you think about like their math class in school, right? Like if they're a grade up in math, that's awesome, but nobody wants to go down a grade in math and be in class with the kids who are perceived as not being as good as them, right? Like a lot of this is sort of cultural expectation about what to point at as being an achievement of their kid. And really what we should be doing is trying to sort of normalize environments that are developmentally appropriate for each kid, not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically, which again is what I think sophisticated and progressive clubs do to the betterment of their players, and is really the only way I imagine that you keep late maturing players around so that they can catch up, and ultimately, once that particular part of the playing field is level, capitalize on the things that maybe they had to do when they were younger.
We talked through this entire podcast, we've talked about the importance of individual consideration and individual environment. And then you see scenarios where entire groups are quote unquote playing up, which is the exact opposite of individual consideration. And then of course, if you do that, and we see that in not just a small number of places, because it's used as a marketing tool, but then at some point, when does that group quote unquote come down or go back to their age group? And that creates the same sort of groupthink not individualized perspective, which has to make you think, is this really being tailored for the learning of the kids? And then you finish with all that saying, this is a really hard industry to be in, to manage all these players and all these parents and all these expectations and all the stuff that goes around it. I guess what we're advocating more than anything through this podcast, if I take a step back, is a little bit of perspective, maybe a little bit of skepticism and willingness to think on your own. I'll use an example that Raymond Ferhan used in a course that I sat in that I thought was really, really good. Where
was he yelling at you at the time?
At this point, he was not.
Okay, great.
He put up a picture of a Champions League winning team, men's UEFA Champions League. And the question was, if you got to spend a week with this guy, and he pointed at a couple people in the picture, what do you think of that? And, of course, the room was like, oh, that'd be awesome. I'd learn so much, blah, blah, blah. And then the next slide was because of or in spite of. And the point was, be skeptical of everything, because they may have won the Champions League because this person added value to the environment. And there's a coach, obviously, or trainer, or in spite of this person, they still won it. And that you can't be awed with brand. You can't be overcome with things that sound good. You have to take a step back, think through, have a little bit of healthy skepticism, and see if it makes sense to you, which I thought was a tremendous, sort of aha moment of not being swept away easily because something sounds good.
Love it.
Just to be sort of like the researcher in the room, the more sort of objective data you can get to either justify the decisions or evaluate the impact of the decisions you make, I think then it becomes sort of an iterative process. So we did a thing, did it actually work? If not, what should we do with that? Or in advance of it, how much can we learn about the potential impacts of what we're going to do and use that to inform our decision?
The researcher in the room. I like that, Drew. I mean, that could be your own podcast.
Christian, you're the skeptic in the room.
I'll take that.
All right.
There's a couple topics we can talk about down the road. I mean, we touched on U18. That's a hot topic right now of how U18, which is in theory the pinnacle of youth soccer, the best level, the best players. It's got its own challenges because that's a transitional period. That's a potential topic in the future. Talked about playing up, playing down, and sort of how that is used or misused. That's another topic we could use in the future. Well, this is great. I appreciate it, Drew, you being here. And we got Ashley, a woman of few words.
It was kind of fun just to sit here and be able to reflect as a coach. So it's like a crash course in what you do with all of your U.S. soccer licensing with Dr. Drew on here, and just being able to be just sit here and not have to do an assignment, just kind of be able to reflect as a coach of go through all of my players. So I enjoyed it. I might have been quiet, but my brain was spinning the entire time in a really good way.
That's well said, Ashley, and hopefully that sums up how everybody feels listening to this week's podcast, part of the new format, the new season of Breaking the Line, the ECNL podcast. When we return, it'll be Doug Bracken and Bracken's Brain Buster. Until one of you out there comes up with a better name, I'm going to keep running with Bracken Brain Buster. There's got to be a better name, so let us know. But nonetheless, our brains will be busted when we return. This is Breaking the Line, the ECNL podcast. This is Dean Linke with a special message from my good friends at Continental Tire. Enter for a chance to win the Continental Tire ECNL Sweepstakes. The first 2,500 entries will receive a custom mini scarf, plus one randomly selected fan will win an all-expense paid trip to the All-Star Game in Columbus, Ohio, July 15 through 18. Visit continentaltire.ecnl.votigo.com to enter now. Official rules apply. Back to wrap up the June 5th edition of Breaking the Line, the ECNL podcast. We go to the ECNL Vice President, Doug Bracken.
I'm now going to ask my question of the day, which Dean has coined as Bracken Busters.
Bracken's Brain Buster.
Okay. I don't think
Dean's been quiet too, man. I think his brain got
complicated.
busted.
Yeah, I mean, I was on here with Drew for a while. My brain is definitely hurting. This is a lot lower level than that, to be fair. So, but I'll go to my questions of the day. And Dean, I will not ask you first today because I feel like you've been asked first a lot and it hurts your feelings. I'm going to go to our guest, Dr. Drew. Favorite athlete all time, why?
I assume you guys will just edit out this super long pause as I try and figure out.
How can you not know this? How can this not be at the tip of your fingers?
My first instinct is to just sort of follow up on Dean and just blurt out my wife, because
Wow.
you made that such a clear path to success last week. I feel like that might undercut your question.
Dean, if you say that today, Dean, you're off the podcast. That's it.
Earlier, I was going to recommend, Dean, that should just be your answer to every question every week. It takes a tremendous amount of pressure off. Might work more times than not. I'll probably think of a better answer down the line, but for what it's worth, I think you maybe alluded to this in the beginning. I spend a lot of time running, and I spend a lot of time running sort of absurd distances. And I think the reason in the end, there are lots of little reasons, but the big reason is that I really like this idea of sort of proving to yourself that the limits you think you have are imaginary, and that sports are maybe one of the best ways to do that. And so one of the athletes that I've always liked that really embodies that is Steve Prefontaine, who was taken away too young, but was sort of the embodiment of effort, right? That it ultimately, what really helps you the most in virtually all situations is how much you're willing to put into it. So I'll stick with that for the short term as my answer, Doug.
A very, very solid answer. All right, let's go to Ashley.
Can I go two? Can I go soccer player and then non-soccer player? Is that allowed?
I guess.
Soccer player, I would have to say Mia Hamm. I don't know if I'm allowed to be a female soccer player and not say Mia Hamm. I mean, 99ers did so much for the game. But overall athlete, I would go Michael Phelps. Just a guy that was dominant for so long and just was like untouchable in his sport. It was just fun to watch him at all of those Olympics and everything. And then, everything he's done for sports afterwards, just being able to advocate for mental health and stuff. I just think he's a tremendous athlete on or in and out of the pool, rather.
Nice. Let's go to Lavers.
I'm not even that much of a basketball fan, but what was the Jordan show that came out a couple of years ago?
Last Dance.
The Last Dance. I watched that, and the insight into his mentality, he's a complicated man, but the just ruthlessness of the way he approached the sport. And it's hard for me not to say Michael Jordan, just because, the accomplishments speak for themselves. But watching that and seeing the interviews and getting some of the backdrop, just ruthless is what came to mind for me. A guy who was willing to do anything to win. And there were some problems with that, I think, that came out in there as well. Is it's a difficult path, but I guess I'd say Jordan.
Incidentally, Christian's wife was an accomplished soccer player, and the fact that he did not say her.
Yes, I was going to say my wife.
Probably,
as well. Yes.
She needs to know that you picked Michael Jordan over her. So I'll let her know. Dean, let's go to you.
Without question, can't miss television for me, and I'm bummed that he's injured and probably won't pass Jack Nicklaus. Tiger Woods, anytime that he is out on the golf course, I'm watching him. Basketball wise, and I know you said only one, but there's three guys that I never missed a game for.
Oh, come on, Dean, you went from 1 to 4 now.
I really want to go 5. I want to go 5. All right, I'll just cut it off. I'll say Tiger Woods, and then my favorite soccer player that I was actually around all time is Michelle Akers. So I'm going to go with those two.
Nice.
Cool.
Also, Tiger Woods, very complicated individual, kind of like Jordan, you would say a little bit. So mine would be Kobe Bryant, the drive to win. Again, another complicated person. And, just the way he matured through his life to the end, where he was so much more of a mentor than he probably was, early on. I have a lot of respect for that. And I guess the crowning moment was when he decided to play on the Redeem team. And if you watched anything about that, when he walked in the room, everybody deferred to him. So he obviously carried a ton of respect out there. So that is my answer. And that's all I got, Dean.
It's like when we go into a research room, we are immediately deferring to Drew. Just immediately. There's not going to be any opinion that goes without Drew's blessing.
I don't go into research rooms personally. Stay in the rooms that see, like my children's art behind me. That's where I stay there.
There you go.
Indeed, there you go. Another edition of the new format, Season 2 of Breaking the Line, the ECNL podcast. I want to remind you that we'll be back in 2 weeks June 19th for our next edition of Breaking the Line, the ECNL podcast. Thank you for listening to Breaking the Line, the ECNL podcast. And remember, if you have a question that you want answered on Breaking the Line, the ECNL podcast, email us at info@theecnl.com.